All right, good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. Welcome to another series of public webinars hosted by the School of Government and Public Policy, or SGPP for short. SGPP is a public policy school established since 2012 with the mission to guide future generations of Indonesian leaders who are ready to face 21st century global issues such as inequality and climate change through progressive policies. My name is Ardi Arsala Rahmani, and I am currently the 6th batch of students pursuing a master's at SGPP. In today's public webinar, I would like to honorarily welcome you, Evan Laksmana. Evan is a political scientist and senior researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Jakarta, Indonesia. He has held visiting and research positions with the National Bureau of Asian Research, Sydney University's Southeast Asia Center, the Lowy Institute for International Policy, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. His scholarly research has appeared in the Journal of Contemporary Asia, Asia Security, Asia Policy, Asian Politics and Policy, Defense and Security Analysis, Defense Studies, Contemporary Southeast Asia, Journal of the India Ocean Region, Harvard Asia Quarterly, and others. His policy essays have been published by the New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, South China Morning Post, the Jakarta Post, East Asia Forum, The Strategist, and others. He has also written for RAND Corporation, Brookings Institution, International Institute for Strategic Studies, East-West Center, Royal United Services Institute, Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, and others. He earned his MA and PhD in political science from Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs as a Fulbright Presidential Scholar. He also holds an MS in Strategic Studies from Nanyang Technological University and a BA in Political Science with cum laude honors from Parahyangan Catholic University. Our theme for today is Indonesia as a maritime state, evolution and its challenges. Evan will begin today's discussion with a history and general concepts surrounding Indonesia's archipelagic nature and follow up with the policies and challenges to date. Before we begin, I would like to share to the audience some basic rules. Do not click share screen in any circumstances. You will be removed from the virtual meeting room if you do so. This is for the panelists. Other than Evan and I. To reduce network usage and prevent unnecessary interruption, we recommend to leave your video and microphone off until you are given a chance to ask a question. We discussed earlier, me and Evan, that we will have a Q&A session, a first Q&A session 30 minutes into the discussion. So please use the raise hand feature or the Q&A feature for attendees. Please be considerate of other participants. And also for the YouTube live viewers, you're also welcome to submit your questions, which I as a moderator will monitor. Thank you, and the camera and microphone is yours to begin.
Thank you. Let me just do this. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to my talk today. First, let me thank Pak Adi for that warm welcome, and thank you for the School of Government and Public Policy for having me today. So today I'll be speaking in more broad terms about Indonesia as a maritime state, how it evolved, what kind of concepts do we use to understand its evolution, and what sort of policy challenges that lies ahead. And then at the end, I'll speak a little bit more detail perhaps about what I believe to be the end of Jokowi's global maritime fulcrum in the last few years. And then we can sort of wrap things up at the end, and we could consider some of the broader implications and what I think to be some of the ways or policy options that we could consider if we were to move ahead in terms of strengthening Indonesia as a maritime state. As mentioned earlier, I'll stop half of the talk at the historical evolution part in case there are some questions, and then I'll get down to the policy challenges in a more contemporary sense in the second session. As we can see, when it comes to defining what is a maritime state, there's a whole host of different definition with different elements and different focus. The first definition is sort of a jumbled mix of basically everything. From understanding maritime state from the perspective of sea power to the kind of technology and synergy in terms of the policies and how that fits within the broader geopolitical dynamics. So as a definition, I think this is excessively broad, and because it seeks to capture everything, I think you pretty much explain nothing. So one of the key problems, I think, with defining maritime state as a starting point is that we need to be very careful about where do we start. Most maritime security analysts like to start with sea power rather than maritime state. And of course, with the starting point from Mahan, where sea power is often defined in terms of the ability to project military power and control the seas, depending on those specific 6 variables or 6 factors. But others think that sea power shouldn't be that limited to military power, and therefore we should sort of enlarge the definition. And Till in particular looks at the distinction, I think, between sea power as a matter of input in terms of the instruments and tools necessary, and the outcome, the kind of influence that you can project using those particular tools. So for Till, I think it's not just what you have, but what you can get with what you have. But again, this remains very much narrow in terms of power in the traditional sense of the word. And it's often defined in terms of specific outcomes at sea, whether it's about particular military battles or whether it's much broader in terms of controlling the waterways. Those who focus on maritime policies and maritime power rather than sea power looks at maritime task more broadly beyond naval power and military capabilities at sea. So this focuses mostly on maritime traffic, on protecting maritime resources, on making sure that the maritime economy is well protected and all that. So the notion of maritime power as opposed to sea power tends to be multi-definitional. But regardless of the definition between maritime power or sea power or even maritime state, a lot of scholars like to invoke kind of an ideal benchmark, what they call as a thalassocracy, which comes from the root word of essentially a maritime supremacy state or a state that controls or rule the sea. And they draw a huge swath of historical examples going to ancient Greek, the Middle Ages, all the way down to contemporary maritime powers like the UK and the US in the past 100 years. So as far as concepts are concerned, I think we are sufficiently broad, both in terms of the starting point as well as the policy challenges. So what I would like to propose is, rather than simply using a broad or convoluted definition at the expense of other aspects, I suggest that we can break it down into 3 different elements. So we can look at the different maritime processes. So this is the nature of the regional and global environment and how the domestic institutions consider that, the different challenges on the maritime domain, whether it's traditional or non-traditional, and how domestic institutions filter those challenges, and as well as marine resources and economic development and environmental sustainability. So on the left side of the slides, it's mostly the kinds of things that you would consider to be part of the decision-making process or the policy formulation processes, the things that you would consider. And then the output would be the specific policies that you propose or that you seek to implement after you process those different challenges. And usually when we talk about maritime policy, some of it deals with elements of foreign policy. So this, for example, deals with maritime boundary negotiations or how diplomatic engagements are designed to uphold the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, for example. Another aspect is most obviously known as gunboat diplomacy, or those that we would associate more with defense or military policy, whether in general or as it touches on the maritime domain. And the other part has to do with law enforcement. So this deals with good order at sea. This deals with coast guards instead of the Navy, for example, and how do you maintain the maritime environment based on domestic and international laws. And most often, the case beyond foreign defense and law enforcement has to do with economic policy. This ranges from trade to blue economy, to the development of the coastal communities. So it remains wide, it remains wide-ranging, but it's still rooted very much under the broader heading of maritime policy. But essentially, when we talk about maritime policy outputs, we are speaking about the specific policies rather than the processes leading to that policy. So we need to separate those two things. So technology, geography, maritime challenges, those generally fall within the things that you would consider in the process. What you come out of that process, the specific policies, is how you deal with or how you process those challenges. Now, on the right-hand side is the variety of maritime security outcomes. So these are the kinds of issues that you want to affect with your particular policies, whether it's on with regards to marine environment. So you want to improve marine safety, for example, reduce accidents. You want to improve climate change, or you want to prevent terrorist acts if you want to focus on the national security elements of those outcomes, minimizing interstate disputes to multilateral diplomacy or bilateral diplomacy. If you want to improve the blue economy through economic development policies, or if you want to ensure that you can contain transnational organized crimes at sea. So the right-hand side, the complexity of the specific issue areas that you want to affect with your specific policies, those I think are mostly associated with maritime policy outcomes rather than the policies themselves. So I think separating these three elements between the processes in terms of formulation, the policy products, and then the outcomes that you want to affect. I think breaking down these three different components helps you assess as well whether or not you should believe the government's claims about the successes of their policy. So we'll talk later on, for example, about the successes or failures of global maritime fulcrum. Are they generally seen to be more successful in the processes part? Are they more successful in the outcome part? Are they more successful in creating a policy output, but not necessarily in changing outcomes at sea? So this helps us a little bit in terms of our starting point, how we can understand a maritime state and policies, and how we can break down which of the different components we want to assess. At the bottom part, you see that arrow between being maritime and maritime power. So Jeffrey Till proposed this distinction. Being maritime means you are aware of your maritime challenges. You are aware of your maritime interests. You realize that there is a whole host of complex issues and problems when it comes to the maritime domain, especially as an archipelagic state like Indonesia. But that's not the same thing as saying I am capable of addressing those challenges, both within my maritime domain and beyond. So when you are capable of addressing your maritime challenges, defending your maritime interests, and even beyond, that's where you sort of transition from being maritime and into maritime power more broadly. So this is your ability to utilize whatever capacity you have whatever instruments you have to change specific maritime outcomes that you see on the right-hand side there to your advantage, or along the lines of your particular interest. So the distinction between being maritime and maritime power, I think, is important because it provides us a spectrum under which the process can lead to particular outcomes that you want to achieve. So I think when you lay out and you break down the different concepts, the different elements of maritime policy, I think it helps you also better understand when we talk about a maritime state, when we talk about maritime power, what is it exactly that we're talking about? Maritime power is mostly associated in changing the outcomes that you want. So that's a lot more closer to being a maritime power on the right-hand side. Maritime state is largely starting from that understanding that you have maritime interests to defend and that you need to engage in particular maritime policy processes to formulate some of those policies. So maritime state is probably a lot closer to being maritime on this particular spectrum. So that transition from a maritime state to a maritime power is obviously something that we have to examine and evaluate based on the historical evolution of that particular state, whether it's the UK, whether it's ancient Greece, or whether we're talking about Indonesia. So when we talk about Indonesia, it's always the most simple step is usually when we start by looking at the map. And obviously the map that we have shows us very clearly that when it comes to Indonesia as a maritime state, clearly it's a truism, if not a simple policy banality, that the maritime domain provides the most set of challenges that Indonesia has to deal with. The maritime domain that we see for Indonesia being at the intersection of the Indian and the Pacific Ocean also tells you that you will be stuck between competing great power interests, whether it's the Soviet Union and the US in the past, or today it's mostly between US and China. Of course, we can talk about this later on about how it's no longer the great powers that matter, but it's the regional middle powers. Do we need to engage and think about how Indonesia interact with Japan, with Australia, South Korea, India, and all that in the midst of China's sort of regional dominance and the US's declining commitment, I believe, in our part of the world. But beyond great power interests, and because of our history, where most of the region also suffers from colonialism, Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular also suffers from the political, economic, and cultural diversities that were set during colonial times. And this is why we can see across Southeast Asia the different political institutions, the different economic development, the different social cultural fault lines and all that. And as a consequence, I think Indonesia and much of the region, I believe, especially in Southeast Asia, are always beset by both internal and external security challenges. To say that Indonesia should only care about external security challenges like China may not be necessarily appropriate when throughout our history for the past 75 years almost, I think about 70% of our threats generally come from internal security challenges, whether it's terrorism, whether it's domestic unrest, or even rebellions and secessionism. So the mix between internal and security challenges will always color how Indonesia views its regional security environment, and how Indonesia views internal security threats will also color how it interprets the maritime domain and the challenges that come with it. So for example, Indonesia for a long time has always seen the challenges with regards to great power politics, not necessarily in the form of an invasion, but to what extent those great power politics affect domestic politics in Jakarta. And we see this, for example, with regards to the current rivalry between US and China. It's the same thing when it comes to the maritime domain. We always see mostly in terms of how it affects domestic economies, like through its impact on through the impact of illegal fishing on the transnational organized crime at sea, or even to maritime economic development in Indonesia's coastal communities. So while the strategic geography, I think, pretty much sets Indonesia's supposed interest in becoming a maritime power, I think the post-colonial challenges, as well as the internal the mix between internal and external security challenges, I think colors how domestic institutions in Indonesia have tried to examine maritime domain. As a bit of an overview of how the concept of Indonesia as a maritime state kind of evolved from the colonial era until today, on the left-hand side from the colonial era, we see that after the Dutch Indies kind of came to be under the administration of the Dutch government after the collapse of the VOC, the idea was how to create a strong colonial bureaucracy in Java, in Batavia, but can still control the inter-island economy across the region. So when the Dutch East Indies sort of inherited what the VOC managed to capture, it was initially ports in Java, some in the Moluccas, some in Sumatra, and some in Kalimantan and Sulawesi. But the idea was to expand that inter-island economy beyond those few ports. So the starting point of creating a strong colonial bureaucracy controlling the inter-island economy was to create ports after they conquest large parts of Indonesia, was to create ports to facilitate both inter-island shipping and international shipping. They tried to merge huge Dutch shipping companies. We think of the colonial armies as the origins of the colonial security forces in Indonesia, when in fact the colonial marine and the civil marine as a way to manage and secure these inter-island shipping was first created about 50 to 100 years before the army was created. And the focus at that point remains regulations on fisheries and salt. But the point about the colonial era was that they understood from the very start that Indonesia cannot be sustained just from Java alone, that the integration of the various islands into one big economy and maintain in terms of its cohesion has to be the foundation of how they can exploit the full potential of Indonesia's resources. Yes, about 60 to 70% of the colonial economy was still agricultural based, but the maritime economy and the facilitation of inter-island shipping and all that was already central from how they wanted to build their colonial rule. So which is ironic, I think, because about 100 or 200 years later, we're still figuring out the same sets of problems as the colonial government, which is how do you ensure that the center of economic gravity is not just in Java, but spread across Indonesia in a much more equal way. I think the post-colonial time for us, especially in the old order, was pretty much laying the groundwork still for the archipelagic state. Muhammad Yamin stated at the beginning, how do we create an Indonesia that's not balkanized, where each of the waterways between the islands were at that time considered high seas. Of course, this was pre-UNCLOS, so most users of Indonesian waters were free to traverse the waters across Indonesia freely. So Muhammad Yamin wanted to figure out a concept that would unify Indonesia both inside and out. So inside being that the waters between the islands became full Indonesian territory as much as the waters surrounding Indonesia. So the Juanda Declaration, I think in 1957, was the first time that we articulated that idea that we should close the gaps in terms of the islands and the waters between the islands, so that becomes one unity, and therefore it allows us to have a wider maritime boundary outside of those islands. Of course, the issue with regards to West Papua in 1962 kind of accelerated that need to have a much more unified archipelagic state. But it didn't happen until 1982, when we have the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, which effectively gave us the archipelagic state status. The negotiation process, I think, with the entire members of the delegation, when we tried to have UNCLOS, in a simple term, we sort of traded off that notion that we should be recognized as an archipelagic state. But to trade that off, we provide a passage through 3 sea lanes of communication, what is now known as sea lanes of communications 1, 2, and 3. So the notion that Indonesia should, for example, control these waterways or tax those ships that traverse those waterways are very much in contradiction to our spirit of basing the state on international law, on the spirit of UNCLOS, that we are unified as a state because of UNCLOS, and that status means that we have to provide a free passage along those designated 3 sea lanes. So I think that was the spirit and the beginning of Indonesia as an archipelagic state, both in terms of de facto as well as under international law. But during the new order, while this was, I think, an exceptional victory for us and our foreign policy, I think the focus remains domestic. So even in the presence of UNCLOS and the final recognition of Indonesia as an archipelagic state, the focus of the new order government remains on domestic stability. So the idea of archipelagic outlook and national resilience, I think, kind of domesticated that notion of an archipelagic state into a way to strengthen domestic institutions rather than ensuring that we have a larger capacity to protect the archipelagic state. So in other words, while we achieve archipelagic state status with UNCLOS, because of the new order system, we still pretty much focused on domestic stability. Yes, we invested more in terms of multilateralism by helping to establish ASEAN. We remain convinced that as long as UNCLOS remains in place, our position remains anchored in international law. And so we start to gradually engage in border talks and delimitation talks with our neighbors. But still, it wasn't the first priority of the new order government. Domestic stability, national resilience, and all that remain central to how the government views its strategic priorities. In fact, at some point, we tried to export national resilience into this concept called regional resilience, in which different countries across Southeast Asia would also invest in domestic stability, economic development, and all that. So I think we had a great momentum in the 80s and 90s to sort of launch Indonesia into becoming not just an archipelagic state under UNCLOS, but also becoming a maritime power. But because of the domestic institutions, I think we were very much stuck in domestic affairs. And UNCLOS itself also did not fully come into effect until the mid-90s, in 94, I believe. So after 98, following the messy transition, again, we're back in terms of focusing on domestic issues. Yes, under Megawati, she issued the Sunda Kelapa calls that we should now start to invest in strengthening our maritime paradigm, in focusing on maritime industry, in how we manage the coastal areas and improve on maritime laws and regulations. But the focus remains on providing those legal institutions and not necessarily on building the necessary maritime capacity. So for much of the early to mid 2000s, the focus was on trying to build those domestic regulations, whether it's about EEZs, it's about shipping, it's about maritime affairs and ocean affairs. But essentially, the focus was on creating those domestic institutions. The problem, of course, is that these domestic institutions, in terms of legal regulations, also create overlapping authorities in terms of the maritime domain. So our maritime domain became much fractured in this between 10, 15 years, I think because different institutions and different bureaucracies were fighting over the same set of pies. So the resulting compromise, I think, on the maritime governance side, eventually created a patchy a system, whether it's in terms of maritime governance, in terms of law enforcement, or whether it's in terms of which part or which domestic institution gets to control which part of the maritime domain. Of course, with decentralization and regional autonomy in 2001, that became a lot more complicated because Jakarta can no longer design a maritime governance blueprint, for example, for development without consulting with the local governments. So in terms of maritime governance itself, I think when it comes to law enforcement, we also have about a dozen overlapping authorities. We can debate whether or not those overlapping authorities are good or bad. Some believe that those overlapping authorities are necessary because there's no one single agency that can control our huge swath of our waters and the resources therein. And others say, no, it's messy. We need just one or two key agencies that control the full range of the waters, from the territorial waters all the way down to the continental shelf. And I think this debate remains ongoing today. And in fact, the solution earlier this year was again invest in domestic legal institutions, which is now about creating, or at least starting to debate about creating an omnibus law for maritime security to address all of these overlapping authorities and all that. But that's something that we can discuss later on as we discuss about the maritime fulcrum. So I think after this long history, I think it was only under President Jokowi in 2014 that he explicitly outlined a wider state doctrine, which is the global maritime fulcrum. We'll discuss that later on about the specific elements and all that. But at the beginning of 2014, at the beginning of his administration in 2014, I think his doctrine sort of provided a new sense of optimism and a new framework in which we can actually move on from becoming just being maritime, or at least becoming an effective archipelagic state into a maritime power. So moving from just realizing that we have multiple maritime interests to defend into actually figuring out the different tools and the capacity necessary to defend them. So the global maritime fulcrum, I think, was perhaps the first wider grand strategy and outlook that gives that sense of optimism that we can actually move forward into becoming a maritime power. So when we look at the long trajectory of Indonesia as a maritime state from the colonial era until today, we see a couple of things. One, the problem of inter-island connectivity, whether it's about people movement, whether it's about the economy, whether it's about security challenges, surprisingly has not changed much. That we remain very much focused on economic development in the big islands, mostly Java. We don't have the capacity enough to fully integrate the economy, the people, and the security instruments necessary to defend a full range of our waters, whether it's internal waters or outside, but mostly outside is where most of our biggest challenges are. It took us a long time to focus on the bureaucratic challenges of having the necessary regulations and law, but we don't invest much on everything else. And I'll talk about that later on when we talk about defense policy and when we talk about foreign policy in general. So the evolution of Indonesia as a maritime state, I think, are still very much influenced by two main issues. One is that sense of colonial legacy, where we try to facilitate economic development and inter-island shipping, but that's mainly to boost economy in Java and sustain the domestic rule and stability. Two, because of UNCLOS, we had the opportunity, I think, to build Indonesia into a much stronger maritime power. But I think the domestic political institutions and interests of the New Order regime, I think, sort of domesticated those external maritime ambitions. So I think there are two strong legacies from this long overview. One is from the colonial era, and one is from the authoritarian era. And I think this is why, conceptually speaking, we're still stuck at being maritime and less moving forward to actually becoming a maritime power. So with that big overview, both on concepts and history, I'll stop right there in case you all have questions first.
Okay, thank you so much, Evan, for your first session here before we head on to the Q&A. I would first like to ask you, throughout the end of your point there, you mentioned the idea that having control over the maritime policy in general should remain disaggregated versus a centralized institution built to cover all of Indonesia. There's this been, you say there's been this back and forth opposition between the two opposing ideas. But I want to ask you, has the scales at least been tipped by 2014 when Pak Jokowi strengthened the Bakamla, previously was the Bakor Kamla, right? With Perpres 178 year 2014, right? Bakamla was given the function and the task to prepare an overarching maritime policy. How has that been so far in your view? Did that tip the scale towards a more centralized maritime policy formulation?
Sure. So two things. I think I'll speak a little bit more later on about Jokowi's maritime strategy in general. But right now on the Bakamla question, I think one, the presence of Bakamla doesn't eliminate the presence of the others. So which means Bakamla becomes not necessarily the first among equals, but to some extent, there's just another bureaucratic actor on the maritime governance side of things. Yes, we're trying to get them to become, for example, the one and only Coast Guard and not necessarily have a different understanding between, for example, the maritime law enforcement units and assets of, let's say, the Transportation Ministry, the Fisheries Ministry. In the first term, there was a Task Force 115, the Navy. So I think, yes, there's maybe about 13 different authorities at the maritime side, but those who actually patrol and have assets to patrol our waters from the territorial sea all the way down to the EEZ is probably only 4 or 5. But Bakamla did not absorb the non-Navy institutions. I think ideally at one point we have to figure out a way in which we only have 2. So we'll have what we call as a dual agency maritime structure, one Navy and one Coast Guard. Right now we have multiple agency structures, so we have multiple authorities at different points of our waters. But Bakamla has not, or rather did not absorb the rest of the assets and patrolling functions of the other institutions. I think Bakamla can never take away maritime law enforcement in general from the Navy, but at least I think Bakamla should be able to absorb the others. The second element, I think, which is, have we tipped the scales a little bit towards a centralized maritime policymaking under Jokowi? Depends on which aspect of the maritime domain you're focusing on, right? We spoke earlier about whether it's the economy, whether it's the security and all of that. So it depends on the specific policy area. But in general, I think I would say that no, we're not closer in terms of having a centralized maritime policy for a couple of reasons. One, we don't have a national security council or even a national maritime council that focuses not necessarily representatives from the different institutions, but an integrated office under the president that collects policy suggestions and ideas across the different institutions and provides specific recommendations to the president. So an executive national maritime security council or a broader national security council is something that we don't have. So right now, as far as the executive is concerned, maritime policy falls within the different agencies and ministries. But even today, when you talk about maritime security, which one do you go to? Do you go to the coordinating ministry for maritime affairs and investment, or do you go to the coordinating ministry for political, legal, and security affairs? Because maritime domain is both. You have the economic aspects that may fall under the coordinating ministry for maritime affairs, but the security aspects may fall under the coordinating ministry for political and security affairs. So even then, you see the fraction of the maritime domain into two different coordinating ministries. This doesn't help, of course, because I think on the maritime domain side of things, different ministries and different agencies have their own bureaucratic interests at heart. So at this point, I think we're not closer to a centralized maritime decision making. Things could change if we actually pass a high quality omnibus law on maritime security. But until that happens, or until the president decides that he should personally be invested in managing the day-to-day challenges of maritime policies, I don't see us becoming a lot closer to having a centralized and coherent maritime policy.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions right now just for this.
Sure.
There are some on YouTube and there are some here on the, I'm just gonna read them out to you. I think what would be most pertinent. One is from Satri Agi, Dinas Perhubungan Pasuruan. Just like maritime security issues, maritime safety also has similar problems, including overlapping policies related to the search and rescue of victims of maritime accidents. Question is there a possible solution for the overlapping to be resolved the same as maritime security? I think, yeah.
Do you want to collect a couple of questions first?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, maybe three.
Yeah, that's one from Satrio Agi. The one from Enrico, our Sync Community Media. About the great power, also rising middle power, sorry. How do you think Indonesia is affected by this transition from being influenced by the global superpowers chess strategy to being in the way of a rising China eager to get her place under the sun? Last one, Amruta Karambelkar. Sukarno once wanted to seize Andaman and Nicobar. Was there an inherent sense of being a dominant maritime power that shaped his outlook?
Okay. Three difficult questions. Search and rescue is also very tricky because you also have the National Search and Rescue Agency, Basarnas, which creates another bureaucratic actor in terms of the management of search and rescue in general and at sea in particular. I think different maritime agencies and institutions in Indonesia have some elements of search and rescue capabilities, but I'm not sure if they're all well integrated with one another. So I guess with regards to search and rescue, it's likely that it depends on the scale of the search and rescue capacity or operation necessary. If it's larger scale, I think Basarnas would be involved for the most part. If it's smaller scale, I think perhaps the different maritime agencies have that limited capacity. But I don't think we have a good sense of how we can integrate the capabilities and assets and facilities of the National Search and Rescue Agencies with the different maritime security agencies. I think this would have to wait probably until we can figure out if and when, let's say, the Coast Guard and the Navy are the only two institutions in charge of the waters and nothing else. But at this point, I think the search and rescue governance and regime is a bit ad hoc, and it may be patchy. Second question on rising China and the middle power moments and how that affects Indonesia. There is how it should affect Indonesia, and there's how it actually affects Indonesia. It should affect Indonesia in terms of its strategic environment, in which Indonesia's maneuverability at the geopolitical space becomes much more crowded and narrow. Now you can no longer simply balance China and the US with one another. You also need to balance the interests of the regional powers. You know, balancing India and China won't be as easy today compared to 15 years ago. Balancing Japan and China is also not going to be easy. So Indonesia's, I think, geopolitical space is becoming much more crowded, and therefore we have to invest less, I think, in old tools of multilateralism and old tools of strategic partnership, and figure out a way if we can create new avenues of unilateral cooperations, of a wider range of strategic partnerships beyond frameworks, but never actually fill them. So I think we do need a new, a geopolitically nimble foreign policy, because our space is becoming much more crowded. But in practice, I think what happens is that these different competing powers, whether at the great power level or at the middle power level, I think the effect is generally mostly on the domestic side of things. And this is particularly when we're talking about China. I think China's effect when it comes to Indonesia's foreign policy orientation is often not fully manifested or not fully seen if it's not through the domestic side of things. I think the economic integration and the increasing vulnerability of our supply chain and our economic growth through China's own economic growth and supply chain, I think puts us in a very difficult position, especially in the last few years. So I think finding the balance then becomes less about balancing US and China, but balancing domestic interests. So balancing competing domestic interests, I think, is where we see the effects of great power rivalry in Indonesia, rather than Indonesia developing a much more geopolitically nimble foreign policy strategy and outlook. So the Indo-Pacific outlook, for example, that we like to pride ourselves in through ASEAN is essentially our inability. It actually indicates our inability to affect geopolitical changes and outcomes independently. We're relying on ASEAN to do the analytical heavy lifting. Actually tells us that Indonesia itself could not change the outcomes if it wanted to. So I think it shows the weaknesses of our foreign policy capacity and the power of domestic political interest as an extension of great power politics. The last question about Andaman and Nicobar, I think when it comes to Sukarno in general, one needs to be slightly cautious about which statements are more reflective of his political agenda at that time, and which statements represent a genuine, well thought out geostrategic thinking. But I do think that Andaman and Nicobar is something of a blind spot for us since then. I think the Indian Ocean is something that we've only belatedly started to invest in, but we haven't fully invested in. In fact, our relationship with India, the de facto regional power in the Indian Ocean, is even not as deep as we would like it. Compared to our relationship with Australia, with China, with South Korea and Japan, our relationship with India is lagging far behind. There isn't even a direct flight from Jakarta to Delhi up until recently. So I think if the Indian Ocean is a strategic blind spot that we have to invest in, I think we need to move beyond regular patrols with the Indian Navy and think about how we can actually fill and deepen the existing strategic partnership framework that we have with India at this point. So I think this is what I said earlier about developing a much more nimble geopolitical foreign policy outlook. And India is, I think, one test in terms of the extent to which we can actually invest in our strategic presence in the Indian Ocean.
All right. Thank you, Evan. So there are more questions, but I don't know. Do you want to proceed with your?
Sure. We can move forward first about the global maritime fulcrum, and then hopefully some of those questions are related to the policy challenges that we face in the past few years. If that's okay with you.
Questions are actually mentioned the GMF in statement.
Okay.
I guess it will be best deferred until your presentation on the GMF.
Okay. Sure. No problem.
Okay.
Okay. Let's move on. As I said earlier, the global maritime fulcrum was initially thought of, or at least a lot of people were optimistic that the doctrine can take us forward into actually becoming a maritime power, rather than just being maritime or simply an internationally recognized archipelagic state. But it should be remembered, though, that the GMF as a doctrine was not a years in the making strategy document. It was formulated initially as a campaign platform, and it was formally launched at the beginning of Jokowi's first term. I think for the first 1 or 2 years, I think there were genuine optimisms across the board, whether it's analysts or policymakers, that the maritime agenda kind of became the overarching framework for a lot of things that the new administration was going to achieve. So I think it is true that it created a boost, I think, at the beginning of his first term. Most of the events that I attended in that first few years always had an attachment at the end, improving defense policy to sustain global maritime fulcrum, even something as banal as improving budget management system to improve global maritime fulcrum. So I think as a bureaucratic framework and jargon, I think it was both good and bad. It was good in terms of it creates an optimism, it creates a much more focused energy, but it's bad in that nobody really knows what it is. It's just a slogan that everybody speaks about, but we don't really know what to do. As you can see on the 5 elements there, I think the GMF had both domestic and external elements to it. Maritime culture, resources, and infrastructure tends to be closer to the domestic side of things, and diplomacy and defense tends to be closer on the external side of things. And at this particular talk, I'll speak more on the external side of things than the maritime side of things. Than the internal side of things. But we can talk more about like the marine economy and all that in the Q&A. I think overall the doctrine remains the most comprehensive and the most tailor-made, I believe, for Indonesia as an archipelagic state to move towards a maritime power. But of course, a big and broad doctrine requires a bureaucratic push beyond here's an overarching framework, right? And it also needs a central hub that manages and implement that particular blueprint. So we need a central hub, ideally under the president, to manage all of the different types and elements of maritime policies. In 2017, we issued the Indonesian Sea Policy Regulation number 16. There's some debate about whether it's properly translated as ocean policy or sea policy. A lot of the government officials call it ocean policy. Some call it sea policy. I call it sea just because in the introduction of the document, they actually cited UNCLOS as the basis of the regulation. And UNCLOS obviously is the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, not Law of the Ocean. So I'm using sea based on UNCLOS per their own introduction. So it's sometimes interesting to see government officials use ocean policy when their own document actually suggests it's sea policy based on UNCLOS. But essentially, the sea policy, as it were, they were created as an interagency process. At that point, it was coordinated through the Ministry for Maritime Affairs, and it helped codify the GMF as part of Indonesia's legal policy system. So I think the GMF as a legal document was codified through this regulation. As you can see, it's obviously uneven in terms of its programs and activities. There are hundreds of policy targets. Most of the programs are somewhat on the domestic side of things. This is priority C, for example, on resource industry, on ocean services, on environmental management and all that. The external side of things, which is priority D, tends to be very small on maritime security. Maritime boundaries and diplomacy is about 16% as well. So the external part of the GMF were not very well developed in this sea policy regulation. But the problem, of course, with the sea policy isn't just the programs and the activities that are heavily skewed towards domestic, but it's the fact that it is essentially not a new program. So what happened was the coordinating ministry asked all of the agencies and the ministries, give me a list of your programs and activities that are somewhat related to maritime policy. And then the coordinating ministry slices and takes on those pre-planned existing programs anyway, and then collect them into one big framework and then call it sea policy. So it's not a new policy that was formulated from scratch. There was no single authority to design those policies or to corral those different agencies into implementing them. These were essentially pre-existing programs that each of the ministries and agencies were going to do anyway. But what happened was that they are simply collected and then be pitched as a sea policy. And of course, because there was no single authority to corral them, and because these were taken from pre-existing programs, there's obviously no specific resources that was dedicated outside of the resources already dedicated by the respective agencies and ministries. So in essence, I think the sea policy managed to codify the GMF, yes. It managed to break down some of the programs that were created separately from the GMF to begin with, and then put them into one big framework, which is why you see hundreds of activities and policies and programs. So in essence, I think the GMF and the sea policy essentially was initially designed as a big grand strategic outlook, but in practicalities, it became very much domestic skewed and very much nothing more than a bureaucratic umbrella document rather than driving guidance for each of the respective agencies to do what they wouldn't otherwise do. So why do we see this failure to launch of the GMF as a wider push across the board? One, I think from an idiosyncratic perspective, I think Jokowi's lack of personal investment in managing the day-to-day aspect of maritime policies in general, particularly when it comes to foreign policy and defense, I think makes it harder to sustain the overall bureaucracy. As I said earlier, when the president is not personally involved, the different agencies and their own interests and their own agendas and their own culture, I think makes the policy formulation process essentially a chaotic negotiation among these different agencies. Jokowi's rise in 2014 and eventual re-election in 2019 also did not expand his close circle of people that would guide him in terms of managing the day-to-day aspects of maritime policy. So I think Jokowi then obviously focuses on a lot more other issues, bearing in mind, of course, from a domestic political standpoint, Jokowi's domestic political base never really expanded because he never really headed his own political party. So he still relied very much on existing party structures, and the focus was a lot more on re-election, obviously. So the priorities then became much more domestically focused, whether it's about infrastructure or social welfare. And as we moved into the election in 2019, I think the domestic polarization of Indonesia's domestic politics makes it less likely that Jokowi would be much more involved on the maritime side of things. So domestic politics, I think, became his main focus in the last 2-3 years of his first term. As I said earlier as well, because the sea policy never became a single overarching document that guides everybody and forces everybody to engage in the same set of policy ideas and activities, I think the rivalry became much more of a problem. On the maritime side of things, as I said earlier, I think the the bureaucratic politics between, for example, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Task Force 115, the fisheries ministries, the transportation ministries and all that, I think the maritime law enforcement agencies as a whole became very fractured, especially in the absence of a National Security Council. And bearing in mind as well that in 2014, a lot of political analysts argue that Jokowi did not personally choose his foreign and defense ministers. They were mainly suggested by his political party base. And of course, I think, as I said earlier as well, the diversity of security challenges, both in terms of internal and external, makes it very complex, makes it very difficult for any one institution or even one political leader to grasp the whole thing. So I think these 4 elements kind of provide us with a larger context of why a maritime security and GMF in particular, I think, never took off as the main strategic instrument to address Indonesia's myriad of maritime challenges. So we move into the second term. As we see at the beginning of the second term, I am of the argument that global maritime fulcrum as a grand strategy, as a policy driver and framework, I think is officially dead. Some of my friends in the bureaucracy would argue that the spirit lives on, that we still focuses on maritime challenges. But as I said earlier from at the beginning, maritime policy and maritime interests are 2 different things. Maritime interests are about maritime challenges. Maritime challenges will not go away for Indonesia. So to say that maritime fulcrum still lives on because we have maritime challenges conflates between policy instruments and policy problems. So as far as policy problems, of course, maritime challenges will always remain. It hasn't gone away. We see earlier this year with regards to the problems in the Natuna, for example. We still see piracy and kidnapping, for example. Illegal fishing remains rampant, although it's been declining a little bit comparatively speaking. So maritime challenges remain, but the maritime fulcrum as a strategic guidance, I think, is no more. And by that, I mean, I don't think policymakers refer to or use the maritime fulcrum to guide their day-to-day policy making. I doubt that they even use the sea policy as a day-to-day guide. So I think the different agencies kind of have their own focus and their own interests. Again, Jokowi also continues to double down on domestic agenda, especially with regards to investment and infrastructure. And these were all pre-COVID. Obviously, with COVID now taking on pretty much Indonesia's resources, interests, and focus, clearly becoming a maritime power is way, way, way down on the list. And because our foreign policy profile continues to follow Jokowi's kind of domestic orientation, the external part of the GMF is pretty much even much weaker, I think, compared to the first term, both in terms of foreign policy and defense. The new cabinet, I think, did not make things better. I think the accommodation of Gerindra complicates the domestic situation, and certainly the calculation of everybody now is pretty much the run up to 2024. The foreign minister remains. There's some considerations to the civil military balance in the new cabinet. The fisheries minister has been replaced, but the fishery minister is now from a political party. But despite these changes, there were no structural changes in terms of policy management on the maritime side of things. In fact, it became more complicated because now we have this idea of the omnibus law to improve maritime governance. I think the fisheries minister now is probably a bit more problematic in terms of the external part when we talk about illegal fishing, as we saw with the incidents with China earlier this year. So the National Security Council remains missing as well. So there's no fundamental institutional or structural change when it comes to maritime policy making and implementation. And of course, COVID pretty much changes the tone for everything else. On the foreign policy side of things, Jokowi has made it clear, I think, that he's very much still focused on domestic issues. I think the current foreign minister's focus remains low-key and reliant on multilateralism. And if there are issues that the foreign ministry or the foreign policy establishment focuses on, like Palestine, for example, these are domestically appealing issues. They're not necessarily within our strategic interests, but they do have a domestic audience in mind. So the kind of oomph, the kind of energy, the kind of drive that the foreign ministry focuses on, I think, is less on the geopolitical dynamics and mostly on low-key issues that matter for the domestic constituents. I think protections for Indonesians abroad are obviously central. Economic diplomacy are obviously central, which is why I think the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs would be the right person to drive the economic diplomacy. But my worry is that economic diplomacy is not equivalent to becoming a salesperson. So to say that economic diplomacy should be central should not be conflated by making all diplomats basically salesmen to bring investments to Indonesia, bearing in mind that the foreign ministry is not in charge of investment to begin with. So to say at the beginning of Jokowi's first term that the job of diplomats should be to bring in foreign investment, I think is a huge mischaracterization of what economic diplomacy is. Multilateral faith, I think, continues. I think ASEAN and the UN-related institutions remain central, as is Indonesia's lack of independent capacity to shape the region. I think the COVID-19 situation also highlights the fact that we are very much not a leading player, whether it's in terms of management of global health governance or even when it comes to shaping a regional response to the pandemic. I think highlighting international cooperation is great, but we are also at a position where we need to sustain foreign assistance for medical supply chains and all that. So I'm afraid that the trajectory of foreign policy would be on figuring out on how to sustain cooperation for our own domestic needs rather than helping to shape the region. And we will continue to, I believe, to bypass regional leadership. I think one should not conflate the presence of a document like the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific as somehow equivalent to the presence of leadership. I think the document highlights our ability to lobby the rest of the ASEAN member states to produce a document with no significant strategic effects, but it doesn't change regional outcomes. I think China's behavior in the past few months tells us that Indonesia is severely limited in stabilizing the maritime environment in the South China Sea. Indonesia is certainly unable to provide the sustained leadership when it comes to formulating a regional response. So I think in terms of foreign policy, the aspects that relate to the GMF at the beginning in terms of the external elements, I think would be maritime diplomacy in terms of engaging with maritime delimitation negotiation with Vietnam, for example, and Malaysia. I think is probably the only one area of the foreign policy element of the GMF that can be maintained and in fact should be supported. but whether or not we can transform those maritime diplomatic activities into a broader strategic push across the region, I think is a separate question. On the defense side of things, both under the first administration and the second administration, I think we're still very much seeing it through how much items or how much we can spend on procuring advanced platforms. So it's still procurement centric, whether it's procuring advanced fighter jets or naval assets. But even in terms of the procurement list, it's still very much service oriented, as in each of the individual services, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, basically submit their own shopping list and requirements and somehow collect it at the Defense Ministry. I think the current Defense Ministry has a different dynamic. I think they have a different idea of what kinds of platforms that they want to procure. And I think that relationship between the Defense Ministry and the armed services, I think, determines to what extent can the defense policy invest in more weaponry and advanced platform amid severe budget limitations. It was already severely limited before COVID. I think it's going to be a lot more restrained and constrained under the current COVID situation. But out of that defense policy logic of procurement, I still think that the maritime side of things remains an afterthought. The Navy, for example, is still seen as providing support and transportation for troops and mobility, and not necessarily as the front line for sea control and maritime control and ensuring that we can keep stability and peace among, for example, our sea lanes of communication. So investment with regards to procurement remains divided equally between the Army, Navy, and Air Force in terms of the value of the budget for procurement. But for me, it makes no sense to do it that way, because if you carve out the pie three ways the same, the amount of money that the Navy can buy with the same amount of money that the Army can buy would be completely different. So I would argue if there is a serious effort on the maritime side to push the GMF ahead on the external side of things of the GMF, we should measure it based on whether or not the Navy gets a bigger portion compared to the Army and Air Force. And so far that hasn't been the case. And again, I think the Navy also is one of the key actors in Indonesia's fractured maritime governance. So I think the Navy also spends its energy competing with the Coast Guard, for example, and with the other institutions. So I think when it comes to broader defense policy and strategy, I don't think we're there yet in terms of the kind of maritime external defense that the GMF initially envisioned. If there are plans for changes in the organizational structure of the military, they're largely driven by personnel pressures like logjams. They're not driven yet to transform the institution from an educational standpoint, for example. And of course, the idea to move the new capital to Kalimantan, which was a serious plan at the beginning of Jokowi's Jokowi's second term, I think would have provided a huge distraction for defense policy. I think the military should be much more focusing on the strategic challenges on the Indo-Pacific, but the new capital would have diverted huge significant costs, equivalent almost to 1 year of the national defense budget, if the military were to transform assets and build new bases in the new capital. So at least on these issues, I think hopefully COVID put to rest the idea that Indonesia should have a new capital, at least in the short term. So overall, I think the military side of things also has not reflected the external aspect of the GMF as it was originally envisioned. So what are the broader implications? I think going back to our first conversation about maritime power and state, I think we need to be very clear, what do we mean when we say Indonesia is or is not a maritime power, is or is not a maritime state, and what are the challenges? I think breaking down in terms of the issue areas, but also the distinction between process, output, and outcome helps us get at some of those questions. Two, I think Indonesia, despite its long history as an archipelagic state, we remain stuck at being maritime rather than moving forward into becoming a maritime power. We don't have a policy coherence across the foreign and military policy establishments, and the maritime economy also remains unable to sustain that trajectory, partially because of the domestic contestation I mentioned earlier, the bureaucratic rivalry that provides inefficiencies in terms of transporting goods, but also the lack of investment with regards to port infrastructure and all that. I think the legacies of colonialism and authoritarian rule still provide a haunting specter. Sure, they're not as strong as we would like them, as we thought initially, but I think they're still there. The problems of inter-island connectivity and de-Javanizing development, I think, was what Jokowi had wanted initially, but I think we remain stuck because of the domestic political challenges, and the capital required to do so hasn't exactly come easy. I think on the military and security side of things, the legacy of authoritarian rule ensured that successive generations of military and political leaders remain married to the idea that the only lens by which to measure or to look at external environment is domestic. So internal security and domestic stability continues to color, I believe, the outlook of Indonesia's current and perhaps upcoming strategic elite. I think the global maritime fulcrum as a driving concept and a strategic guidance, I think, is dead. I think the primacy of domestic politics ensures that even if some parts of the spirit lives on within the bureaucracy, I think a domestic political contestation, whether it's re-election or 2024, I think will be much more prominent in the minds of policymakers, despite of the fact that we are in the midst of a pandemic. I think rather than allowing Indonesia to become a maritime power that can provide a good strategic hedging behavior in the Indo-Pacific, I think the GMF sort of decayed into an arena of inter-bureaucratic balancing between the different institutions involving maritime security. How do we move forward? From the top, I think we obviously have to consider that for the next few years of Jokowi's administration, I think the focus would be on public health and domestic economic recovery. So we would have to wait for a new president in 2024 that hopefully shows some interest in managing the day-to-day aspects of maritime policy beyond, here's a set of documents at the beginning, but let me do other things afterwards. And it's also likely that we have to wait for a new DPR, a new national legislature, to provide strong oversight with regards to maritime policy as well. But in what aspects and how, I think it would remain fractured. So hopefully that in the new administration in 2024, one lesson that I think we can take from the GMF is not necessarily how grand and sophisticated your concept would be, but how sustainable is the maritime outlook. And by sustainable, I mean not just in terms of conceptual coherence, but also bureaucratic push and buy-in and support. On the domestic side of the institutions, I think the relationship between central and local government, I think will remain central in terms of determining how far we can transform the maritime economy, for example. One of the difficulties with regards to maritime infrastructure, whether it's about a port management or even creating new ports, has been with regards to the negotiation between the central and local governments. The blueprint may come from the government, but the negotiation happens at at the local level, whether it's in terms of land clearing or even just hiring workers to build what is necessary. The second element, I think, has to do with how do we manage the rise of oligarchic politics in the past 10, 15 years. I think how the different political economic actors play into maritime policy making. We've seen this with regards to fisheries. We've seen this with regards to foreign policy. I think will determine the extent to which the state can improve its capacity and its quality to deliver a sustainable maritime policy. And this is not even talking about the ability of the state to deliver on COVID-related policies and issues. On strategic planning and governance, on the maritime side of things, I think we have to figure out how to integrate both spatial and economic planning as well as defense transformation planning. I think one issue that sort of becomes a problem between the civilian side of the government and the military side of the government is this lack of joint planning with regards to scenarios that Indonesia is likely to face in the medium and long term. On the maritime side of things, I think managing the relationship between the different maritime law enforcement agencies would be central. As I said earlier, I am in favor of having a dual agency model of the Navy and the Coast Guard leading the way, and having that integrated with a wider set of coastal management policies across the country. And finally, I think with regards to foreign policy, there needs to be more investment, I believe, in figuring out systems building on the foreign ministry side of things to provide fresh new ideas and policies beyond relying on existing tools like multilateralism or ASEAN. And then we can figure out a way to be much more geopolitically nimble and follow our specific maritime interests. I think with that, I end my long lecture. Hopefully we can have some time to discuss some of the questions you might have in the next maybe half an hour, 40 minutes. I'll leave that up to you, Ardi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evan. Just to wrap it up a bit, so you opine that the GMF, the Global Maritime Fulcrum, was initiated with the first term Jokowi presidency, has languished, and this is due to mainly the geopolitical interest taking a back seat. For those of you who would be interested to revisit the presentation that Evan just did, I recommend you to read what Evan wrote at Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. His post-mortem analysis of the GMF is very robust in my opinion, and it provides great insight on what was just presented now. Now, before we get into the second term of the Q&A session, I do have a plug, just a quick plug. The School of Government and Public Policy is currently opening admissions for the academic year of 2020 to 2021. The admissions will be open until the 30th of June. You're welcome to visit our website, sgpp.ac.id. Scholarships are available for select students. SGPP also publishes our own academic journals at the Strategic Review, which is also accessible. Articles are readily accessible at sr.sgpp.ac.id. So, for the next round of questions, I would first like to give a chance to Boy Anugrah, who raised his hand in the panelist section. I will unmute your microphone, Mas Boy. Please ask away.
Thank you very much, Mas Ardi, my colleague in SGPP. Good afternoon, Pak Evan. My name is Boy Anugrah, student of SGPP. Yeah. I have two questions. Number one, in the government and parliament, there is discussion about the Omnibus Law regulation draft in the field of maritime security, in which the objective of this regulation is to simplify process and coordination and put those things under coordination of Bakamla, as mentioned by Pak Ardi. My question is it really important to have this kind of regulation, given the fact that the process will take a long time in parliament, and there is a problem in our bureaucracy, which is silo organization. And the second one related to the challenge faced by Indonesia as the maritime state. Pak Evan, how do you see the effectiveness of trilateral cooperation among Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines as security regime in keeping and maintaining security issue in Sulawesi, which is part of Indonesia maritime region. That's my question, Mas Ardi. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. The first one on omnibus law. I see the law as a last resort. I don't think it should be the first option. I can see from those who advocate the law that it's the only way to address the overlapping authorities of the different maritime related institutions. Although I think I'm on the side of Pak Hafaz and others who argue that the overlapping part is more myth than practical a reality. Because when it comes to maritime security, the issue is less about 13 agencies and more about 5 or 6. So I think this can be addressed if there's a presidential determination and discretion. Sure, some presidential regulation or different aspects of the different laws behind, for example, the role of the Sea and Coast Guard with regards to the Fisheries Ministry, or the Transport Ministry versus the Coast Guard, that is Bakamla, is a bit problematic, but I think it's still within the presidential discretion, if he wishes to simply designate a new regulation that says, okay, from now on, existing assets and authorities to patrol the waters are all given to Bakamla. The Navy provides a supporting role if necessary, especially on the EEZ and beyond. I think this doesn't require an omnibus law, but this is, of course, just on the maritime security side of things. Of course, things would be different if we focus on the broader maritime governance, which is what I think the omnibus law is. But you're right, I think it creates unnecessary political hurdle, because now it becomes a huge political agenda that we now have to involve all kinds of political parties. There's still negotiations with their interests and all that. So I think that seems unnecessary for us to spend so much energy on that. Another way of getting around that problem, aside from presidential determination, is to focus on what I call bottom-up cooperation. So learning from the example of Japan and South Korea, for example, they don't need a single authority to unify, let's say, the different authorities on maritime governance, but they simply develop a common operational doctrine and procedures between the Navy and Coast Guard in which they cooperate in managing the waters. So a bottom-up, slowly built habits of cooperation, common training, common education, common doctrine between the Navy and Coast Guard, for example, I think is much more manageable rather than investing in political resources to pass an omnibus law that doesn't really get at the problem anyway. So that's my view on the omnibus law. On the trilateral mechanism, I think you're right. I think the example of Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia, I think, is a good example of what is called minilateral cooperation. So it's not just 2, but it's less than 10, right? It's essentially not a multilateral form, but not also a bilateral form. I think we've done that before as well with regards to the Malacca Strait Patrol. So the cooperation that we have with the Philippines and Malaysia is another example of that. I think there's a lot of potential there, but we need more. What we have now are essentially coordination mechanism, which is to say, in a very simplistic terms, okay, on Tuesdays at 5 o'clock, I patrol my area while you patrol your area. You know, that's not enough. We need a much deeper cooperation. We even need, in fact, if possible, joint training and even joint education over the long term. So I think minilateral cooperation is the beginning. It shouldn't be the end. So we need to develop much deeper forms of institutionalized cooperation beyond coordination if we want to see its strategic effects.
Okay, Pak Evan. Next question is from Angelo Wijaya from UGM. It's pretty elaborate in chat, so I'll try to sum it up in hopes that I won't be overly reductive. So he asks, how should Indonesia, with its maritime interests, navigate between the China's Belt and Road and the US Indo-Pacific strategy, given the two's maritime-based nature? And a follow-up to that would be, regarding the SCS COC, South China Sea Code of Conduct, are you optimistic it will be agreed upon by 2021? Yeah, that's it.
Okay, I'll answer the easier but more straightforward one, which is the Code of Conduct. It's obviously not simple, but my sense is if the question is, am I optimistic that we'll see it next year? No, I'm not. One, because of COVID. I think a lot of the key agendas are being pushed back. Two, I really don't want to follow the Chinese timeline on this, which is to have this done in 2021, because I'm more worried if there is something worse than no COC, there is a COC, but a low quality one. We need a high quality COC, one that would, for example, tell us in which areas would these Code of Conduct applies. There should be some form of legally binding arrangements and all that. So if it doesn't have the effect that we need, which is to change the behavior, hence Code of Conduct, right? I would rather not have it by next year. So I think I'm not optimistic because of those two reasons. One, COVID, and the other one, I would rather not have a low quality COC next year. On the Belt and Road, I think the government's position is that we are certainly not close to it. We are certainly open to the Belt and Road. In fact, before COVID, we had proposed to China dozens of projects across Indonesia that could be incorporated into the Belt and Road. I think the last one I saw something along between close to $10 to $15 billion, depending on the value of the project across Indonesia. So we are certainly, at least at that point, we are certainly willing to engage China on that. I think we are less concerned about what some analysts call debt trap diplomacy and all that, because we are trying to push that where whatever project that we participate in with the Belt and Road, it doesn't come out of the state budget. It's a business-to-business deal, although by that we mean state-owned enterprises, so it's a bit ambivalent. On the US Indo-Pacific, we are certainly not happy about the military elements of the Indo-Pacific, which is why we propose our own ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific as an alternative, although, as I said earlier, providing an alternative venue which is inclusive versus changing the dynamics between US and China are two different things. So the ASEAN outlook provides an alternative voice for the sake of having an alternative voice, yes, but it doesn't change the dynamics, I think, between US and China. So I think on this particular instance, because the US itself believes that its Indo-Pacific outlook, its Indo-Pacific strategy is heavy on security and military elements, that's the one area that we cannot necessarily bandwagon, right? So from that standpoint, I think it's fair to say that as far as the two competing visions for the Indo-Pacific between China and the US, I think we're a lot closer to the Chinese vision, just because of our own necessity with regards to infrastructure and economic development. If the US, let's say under the new president, God willing, is no longer so married to the idea of just the military elements of the Indo-Pacific, that the US comes back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership and all that, that its commitment to ASEAN is renewed, I think we can be part of or support that vision. But as long as the US remains mired to the security elements, I think it's hard for us to say that we fully support that, the US vision. So I think the balancing part, if it's just measured based on the different competing vision, I would have to say we're a bit closer to the Chinese side than the US side.
All right, thank you, Evan. So the next question from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have Pak Andre Siregar, Director for Asia Pacific Intra-Regional Cooperation. Pak Andre Siregar, please. I've just unmuted your microphone. You're welcome to talk.
Thanks a lot. I wanted to congratulate you for discussing this, Evan. I think you made a very good analysis on how the Global Maritime Fulcrum began and how it is today. I suppose one thing that I might have to point out is that you didn't put much emphasis on the foreign policy. You focus more on the multilateral. From my side, we do know we do act on the IORA front and the CTI-CFF and many other maritime diplomacy cooperation efforts, and they're pretty significant. But I understand if you're looking for the big picture, if it's to be an index of GMF, it's probably peanuts compared to how much other countries are investing. But we are still committed on that one. And if there was no COVID, I think Bu Retno's vision of Indo-Pacific connectivity and infrastructure forum would have been the one that calculated the economic value of Indo-Pacific instead of just making it into a jargon, but the COVID took over. I suppose I wanted to ask you a question now, Evan. At the end of the day, again, some of us are still, like you mentioned, some bureaucrats are still believing in the GMF. I think the problems with your analysis, in my opinion, is that we're looking at the GMF from a national perspective of development, and as much as we know that its potential is significant, you're very right to say that the policies do not support that. What do you think would be the threshold? I mean, like at the bilateral level, regional level, we've done much at the maritime development. If you ask KKP, they've done significant. But I suppose from what you say, if the GMF is dead, it just means that not enough is being reflected compared to the national development agenda or the national strategic agenda. So again, just those comments, my friend. Thanks a lot, and the great presentation.
Thank you, Pa. I really appreciate your insights and your analysis on the Connectivity Forum. And yes, I fully agree with you that I think the Connectivity Forum would have been, at least in terms of providing an implementing framework or mechanism for some of the ideas that Bu Retno might have with regards to the Indo-Pacific, I think would have been a great extension of that. Yes, I think it's clearly unfortunate that COVID took over. I am less, I guess, less persuaded with regards to the value of IORA, just because of, I think, the different competing interests and the huge scope of issues between those multiple countries. I think we, at least from the perspective of an outside analyst, I think there is a conflation between strategy and instruments. I think a boosting instrument in itself is not equivalent to having developed a long-term strategy and figuring out to what extent they can change the outcomes. I think focusing our energy on the instruments, whether it's IORA, whether it's the forum, whether it's multilateralism, I think that's focusing on the processes. As I said earlier, I think when we talk about the full range of maritime policies, process and output are only two elements of the overall spectrum, and we need to figure out what kind of outcomes we want to change and we want to see. If the Indo-Pacific outlook is focusing on Indonesia's vision for the region, what sort of region do we would like to see? Are we expecting, for example, the decline in freedom of navigation operations from the US? Are we expecting China to intrude less in our exclusive economic zones? I think the breaking down of the specific maritime related outcomes is what's missing from the foreign policy strategy. With regards to, and I think this relates to your question about the threshold, what sort of threshold we should think about when we want to see that the GMF is up and running. I think, as I said earlier, I think we have to separate the GMF between, one, a set of maritime challenges and issues, and this I think will outlast the GMF or any government for that matter. The presence of maritime issues and challenges is not equivalent to the presence of GMF. I understood GMF to be a grand strategic framework that drives policies. And I think in this regards, I think the GMF has come and passed, but it's up to us, I think, to figure out how to address the maritime challenges. I think three thresholds, I think, would be necessary for me to say that the GMF is still alive and kicking. Sure, one is kind of the more obvious one, which is to what extent the document has an implementing blueprint and strategy beyond collecting existing policies. So if we would like to see a guiding document and framework that's new and doesn't take on from existing policies and figure out the full range of the process, output, and outcome, that'll be great. But putting that aside, the second aspect, I think, if we assume that whether or not the GMF is alive as a strategy document, what kind of important threshold would we like to see with regards to the foreign policy and the maritime side of things? I think there has to be a serious improvements on the maritime governance. I think as long as we are still holding to the multiple agency model, where there are multiple agencies involved with managing maritime security and not two, which is the Navy and Coast Guard, I think we will never be able to fully realize our maritime potential into becoming a maritime power. Second, I think on the foreign policy, I would like to see less multilateral institution building, because I think multilateralism serves a purpose and not that purpose is very limited. It's not all of our strategic interest. I think there's a time and place for norms building, and there's a time and place for action. And I think multilateralism, especially through ASEAN, isn't that place for action. So with regards to foreign policy, I'd like to see more 2+2, more 2+2 meetings, more defense and foreign minister meetings with India, with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia. We already have some of those, not all of them. And I think I would like to see more investment on the Indian Ocean side of things, which is our strategic partnership with India. I think we have not invested enough time and energy, whether it's from a people-to-people relationship or military or naval or maritime security cooperation. So I think if in the meantime we can do a lot more 2+2 as the overarching strategic framework, then I think we can figure out a way to deepen the bilateral partnerships with key states like India. And only then I think we can explore new ideas like minilateralism. For example, India, Japan, Indonesia, India, Indonesia, Australia. I think these minilateral options provide us with a range of choices rather than just either bilateral partnership or multilateralism. And I think these are ideas that we haven't fully fleshed out. Thank you.
Okay, Pak Andre, I hope that suffices.
Really good, really good. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so Evan, yes, that was a very interesting answer as well and point of view from your side, Evan. There's still many questions to go. I just want to try to briefly sum up a bit regarding your latest point through to the answer, because I want to bridge this with the questions that relate to your first part of the presentation rather than focused on the GMF. I remember that you tweet a lot, well, not that many, but has a long-time follower about buck passing, the concept of buck passing. And I also remember learning it during my undergraduate studies in international relations. I was hoping if you can try to explain a bit, how has Indonesia buck passed its position vis-a-vis ASEAN in the maritime space? With that, I also navigate to the question from Pia Danauer from Griffith University, because she asks, Indonesia's effort to formulate an ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook have been seen as both a display of Indonesia's leadership as well as a reversal of Jokowi's alleged shift away from ASEAN. In your view, who are the main domestic players shaping this policy?
Difficult questions. Let me start at the back end. I think when it comes to the Indo-Pacific outlook, or in particular the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific that we proposed, my sense is that the domestic constituents are not that many and that strong compared to, for example, our policies in dealing with China, for example. So the domestic audience are not as strong on the ASEAN side of things. It has always been the case. It's not unique to the outlook in particular. It's just when it comes to domestic constituents and power, dealers and brokers, ASEAN isn't high on the agenda. Is it a reversal from Jokowi's initial kind of reluctance to engage ASEAN? Yes and no. Yes, in that I think Jokowi realizes, well, our best foreign policy instrument is the one that we've invested decades of our time in, which is ASEAN. But no, as in it doesn't go far enough. I think using our diplomatic capital to lobby for the outlook to be adopted is completely understandable. But the problem is that the document itself doesn't do anything. So it's equivalent to lobbying for a variation of a chairman's statement. Plus the content, so aside from the effects, the content of the document itself is also not new. They are essentially reiterations of everything that we've agreed on in previous ASEAN meetings. So there's nothing new in terms of norms. There's nothing new in terms of areas of cooperation. We've discussed about maritime cooperation since forever in ASEAN. Yes, there's some new agenda that Singapore has asked us to put in, like smart cities and all that. But there's nothing new in that regard. So there's no innovation attached to the particular document. If there is a potential path-breaking idea, but did not get far enough attention and resources, is the idea to bridge the East Asia Summit with HIORA, for example. So how do you bridge the East Asian regional architecture with the South Asian regional architecture? That is something that's potentially interesting and important, but we don't invest time and energy on figuring out the strategy, the resources, and the tools to actually go there, including the institutionalization of the East Asia Summit. So one of the key debates in the past 10 years is if the East Asia Summit is the flagship forum of ASEAN that provides the highest political strategic decision-making forum for the top leaders from the region, why not institutionalize it into something more meaningful rather than just an annual meeting? Do we need to create an East Asian Secretariat? Do we need to have regular programs? Do we need to have activities? And some of that has been addressed, but we are not nearly enough, not nearly there in terms of actually having a fully institutionalized and functioning East Asia Summit a mechanism. So I think those two are what I feel are the potential of the ASEAN outlook. But of course, that's not what we've spent our time on. Right now, the energy is spent in promoting this as an alternative voice of ASEAN with regards to the competing different Indo-Pacific visions, as if the presence of alternative visions alone is sufficient. And I don't think that's sufficient. And this goes back to your question about buck passing. The idea of buck passing, there's a whole different route where that comes from, which is from the alliance theory literature in IR about in the face of threats, you buck pass and not face the threat head on. And buck passing is part of the problem that led to World War II, for example, through chain ganging and all that, but that's a separate theoretical debate. In the context of Indonesia's foreign policy and maritime security, why do I use buck passing? Because I think it is more convenient when you consider the fact that, one, Indonesian foreign ministry budget has not significantly been boosted in the past few years. In fact, the rise in the budget is often accounted by inflation rather than a significant development of resources. And most of the resources of the foreign ministry remains on routine expenditures, operational expenditures, and personnel. So we need an extra diplomatic capital, especially in terms of resources, if we were to allow the foreign ministry to have sufficient capacity and resources to engage in some sort of leadership capacity. Because otherwise, a lot of energy will be spent on attending meetings. There are hundreds, if not 1,000 meetings that's just ASEAN related a year. That's not even including the other meetings, which is why I think a few years back, Jokowi even initiated a review of our membership in multilateral institutions, which were several hundred, and not all of them were particularly useful. So I think in the absence of strategic capacity, whether it's in terms of foreign ministry resources or investment in terms of relationships with regional leaders, it'll be hard for us to engage in any sort of leadership capacity. How are we to push for a wider ASEAN strong response against China, for example, when the perception at the beginning of the first term was that Indonesia would rather have a stronger relationship with China than say anything when there are problems with Vietnam, when there are problems with the Philippines, we refrain from doing or saying anything. When there was a ruling from the UN Tribunal on Law of the Sea in 2016, our statement was also bland and uninspiring. It didn't even mention the ruling that was actually in favor of one of our ASEAN members, the Philippines. So these sort of bland statements over time, I think accumulates in a depletion of our strategic capital to allow the rest of the region to let us lead. And without capital, without resources on the foreign ministry, how are we supposed to lead? Providing a narrative that the ASEAN outlook is Indonesia's response gives the impression of leadership when it's actually not, because it allows us to claim we provided leadership when, one, there is no effort, there's no effects of that document. Indonesia's leadership focuses on the process of passing the document, but afterwards, what do we do? Pak Andre said earlier that we would have had the connectivity forum. I think that would have been one example where we may not just be backpassing, that we may actually invest a little bit in putting meat to the skeleton, as it were. But before that, it's not, where we actually haven't corralled ASEAN to make a stand on the South China Sea issues. We rely on the COC process. And it is not clear, I think, whether or not the ASEAN outlook itself represents leadership rather than an investment in processes. Investment in processes, again, not the same with changing strategic outcomes. So for me, as long as Indonesia is not independently investing capital and resources to change strategic outcomes, I still think Indonesia is not leading.
All right, so we do have a lot more questions and we're supposed to end by 3. So I presume we could take a couple more. We have like 6 minutes until the end. So there's this question from the Q&A. It's pretty interesting. I just want to segue a bit outside the idea of the GMF in Indonesia's maritime domain, the challenges within it. So the question is, it's interesting actually, how Indonesia could enhance the role in Indonesia, in Indo-Pacific as a big archipelagic state in the middle of the region. What about considering total diplomacy, including space diplomacy in this issue, seeing that we lack in maritime diplomacy? So I guess the question is, why continue looking straight ahead and looking down when you can look up? I guess I'll leave that for you to answer first.
It's certainly interesting. Space diplomacy and space policy is one of those areas that are important but underexplored, just like cyber. I think cyber security policies and our ability to shape cyber norms, for example, both in ASEAN and globally through the UN, I think is something that we've been trying to do. So I think space is certainly something that's worth thinking further. The problem, of course, is that what do we bring to the table? Are we playing our usual role of well, we're not contributing anything beyond providing the venue in which you guys can talk. That's more often what we do when we don't have the resources or we don't have a specific agenda that we want to push. Usually we are what I often call, a strategic convener role. Skeptics call it event organizing role. I think that's too much. We're not just organizing events; they have a strategic meaning, but we play that convening role. I'm just not sure what kind of space. No pun intended. What kind of space do we have for space within the ASEAN burgeoning institutions? I think right now a lot of the ASEAN-related institutions, ADMM Plus, the ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit. I think there's some discussions, but I don't see it becoming so central just yet. And I don't know whether this isn't a logistical issue, as in we simply don't have room for meeting number 1003 when we already have 1002 meetings. I don't know whether this is a logistical issue or that no one country has been exceptionally driving the agenda. I think Singapore pushed the agenda on smart cities, for example. And I think at some point, smart cities require sophisticated infrastructure backed by proper SATCOMs and proper relationship and cooperation with regards to space. So I think maybe there's an entry point there. I'm not sure, but it's certainly worth thinking further and exploring further. Though I suppose at this point we also need to bring in people from the business side of things, the communication companies, and the cyber companies and all that, beyond just the government. So I think this is the kind of issues that are ripe for non-governmental roles and non-governmental actors beyond just what the government aims to do.
Okay, so yeah, that was a really interesting question to just segue a bit. Now, another question comes from Jacob, a colleague of mine at SGPP. He also works at the National Resilience Institute, Lemhanas. So I think this question really relates to the overarching theme that you've presented with regards to Indonesia's maritime policy that has been a rather conflict between the outward versus inward facing direction. So how, Jacob, I guess I'll just conceptualize the question this way. The geostrategic doctrine of national resilience, is that the one that has been influencing our defense policy? And will Indonesia be a major power country continuing on with such geostrategic doctrine?
This is a bit tricky because I think the problem is less on policy and more on concept. Some of the geostrategic doctrines that are part of the discourse or idea of national resilience, I think, is well rooted in the conception of our strategic geography, as I said earlier. So I think that part of our strategic geography will remain, right? Geography is destiny, as others would say, right? So that part isn't going to change. We will always be in the center of great power politics. We will always be in the center of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. We will always be in the center of internal versus external threats. Those parts, I think, will outlast any government. So that part, I think, it doesn't matter whether it's GMF or something else. The strategic geography of Indonesia, I think, will remain. The problem is with the concept of resilience. The problem with the concept of resilience, beyond the long list of indicators, the National Resilience Index that's been issued regularly, is that one, the index, I think, conflates too many issues and indicators that it's less meaningful as a methodological tool to get at what you want. So two, I think there's a conflation between resilience as a process and an outcome. How do we know a resilience when we see one? is it a resilience in terms of what? An economy that is less susceptible to external crisis? Is it economic growth? Is it the this the widening or less widening gap of economic inequality? So it's more about figuring out the specifics of the outcomes that you want to see in which you can classify as resilience, or do you want to see resilience as an ongoing process? In the initial conception of national resilience, I think the idea was about domestic stability, right? Domestic stability that was required to sustain economic development and all that. I think it has obviously evolved into much more sophisticated conceptions over time. But as a policy guidance, I'm personally more confused from a conceptual and methodological standpoint rather than the idea of national resilience. I think if we were to refine the policy concept in a more systematic, coherent way, I think there's a lot to offer. But right now, as it stands, I don't see a national resilience as necessarily a very useful policy guidance concept.
Okay, thank you so much again. Evan, how many questions more would you like to take since we've already...
I'm okay with another maybe 15 minutes if you want.
Yeah, sure. Okay, because there's a lot of questions, and there are this is the next set of questions that I really want to go to, because I see a lot of interest with the Quad, which correct me if I'm wrong, refers to the QSD, or the Quadrilateral Security Bloc, that was recently revitalized in 2017. Yeah, it's a security arrangement between India, Australia, and the US and Japan, four countries. Now, the overarching questions that have mentioned this Quad is about whether Indonesia could include itself, or rather, could Indonesia upstart something similar of their own?
That is certainly a thought-provoking idea. Let's start with what the Quad is and what the Quad isn't. I don't think the Quad is a military alliance yet, although they do involve countries like US and Australia, which obviously have alliance among themselves. But it is initially more of a informal gathering in response to the tsunami. So the initial impetus was practical in that sense. It sort of evolved over time into whether or not this is a grouping that is designed or is thinking about containing China. So the China element of Quad is certainly very strong, albeit not officially recognized, right? I think India and Australia are somewhat hesitant to see this or publicly present this as an anti-China coalition, although one can certainly see it that way. So if that's the case, aligning ourselves with the Quad may not be the best idea for Indonesia. And by aligning, I don't mean necessarily building an actual alliance, but just being a member, a fifth member, if you will, into what, Pentaquad, I guess, if that makes sense, or a diamond, whatever that means, is probably not a good idea, because I think while it was initially practical, now it's sort of more strategic and somewhat China related. So I'm not sure we should go down that route. Should we create our own, though, minilateral grouping? I think so. I think a minilateral grouping of our own is an idea worth debating. Now, whether or not that minilateral is smaller, so let's say just 3 countries, let's say Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia, we'll call it the North Natuna Dialogue. 3 countries that are within the Sunda Shelf Maritime Domain, who are faced with similar challenges in the maritime sphere, whether it's fishing or intrusion by China, right? So that's more practical, it's more small and manageable. And then we can see if we want to build like a larger one, let's say us, India, Australia, or us, India, Japan, right? And then maybe we can see if we can do 4 and 5. But right now, I think minilateralism as an idea and as a policy option is something certainly worth thinking. The problem with minilateralism and why I think it's hard for Indonesia to engage in this is, what resources do you bring? With the Quad, they have their own resources. India, US, Australia, and so forth, they bring their own resources, whether it's security, whether it's economics, whether it's diplomatic heft, but they bring resources. What kind of resources do we bring? If it's minilateral with neighboring countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, I think the resources are within our capacity to bring. But if it's with a higher, shall we say, more capable middle power like Australia and Japan, what do we bring to the table? So I think these are questions that I don't know the answer yet, but I think we should ask them nevertheless. If we were to formulate options, new ideas about foreign policy alignments in between multilateralism and foreign policy, and bilateralism, what kind of resources can we bring to the table? And this is something that I think we should keep debating.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting point that you made earlier about allocating resources and contribution, because I'm pretty sure with regards to diplomatic heft and economic resources, to an extent, we might be able to contribute at least to a bilateral arrangement. But I guess, again, if the extent goes further beyond that, it would be difficult for us, considering as well that Indonesia, Pak Jokowi, or maybe, I'm not sure if it was Pak Jokowi specifically, but the narrative has been that we've wasted a lot of resources in international arrangements and institutions, which we would like to retract now from. Now, talking about resources, then I want to segue this to budgets. There's a question from Kioni Marzuki from RSIS. She asks that the reallocation, the redistribution of budget in favor of the Navy is an interesting point that you brought up. And she asks now what would be the appropriate approach for such redistribution without having to incite a blowback from the Army, and subsequently sharpening inter-service rivalry.
Let me pick up from what you said earlier about resources first, and then we'll go to the Navy. It's hard, for example, to say, let's have minilateral arrangements. Oh, by the way, I just want to talk. I don't want to invest resources. It's hard because that means it's a high-level meeting without any follow-through, right? Which is why one idea is to focus on a bottom-up approach. So instead of cementing a minilateral arrangement with a foreign minister or a 2+2 or even a summit, let's focus on the day-to-day practical cooperations like exercises on search and rescue, stuff like that. But the problem is, of course, resources are scarce, not just in terms of Navy development in general or Coast Guard development in general, but also operational costs. It is often difficult for us to engage in international cooperation at sea, not necessarily because of the foreign policy mechanism that's missing, but because when push comes to shove and we have to devote resources to provide fuel for exercises, to provide a logistical support for training, to provide regular patrols and all that, it's often required that we need to demand an extra set of resources beyond what it's already allocated or given to us. So it's pretty hard to engage in minilateralism when you still have to go multiple rounds with the finance ministry to ask more money to pay for a trip, essentially to engage in joint patrols or exercises. So the sustainability of the funding model that is required for a larger practical cooperation is also an important part of the discussion. And this is why I think the question about the Navy redistribution is important. It's hard to say that there is an ideal approach that wouldn't provoke a backlash or resistance from the army. By its very nature, the army is the largest service. So by its very nature, the chunk of the budget will go to the army, right? So that one, you cannot flip a switch and it will change. That one is like changing the doctor to patient ratio. You cannot change it overnight. It takes time. So the majority of the defense budget will always go to the army just because of the size. So if we just use salary and routine expenditure, it will always go to the army anyway. What we can maybe work with is the procurement budget for the long term. So maybe on a year-to-year basis, we can figure out a way that the procurement budget of the Navy, instead of 30%, it becomes maybe 50% over 10 years, and the Air Force and the Army, let's say the Air Force 30% and the Army 20% over 10 years. So you make it gradual, but if you accumulate it over time, it becomes that the Navy becomes 50%. So the year-to-year cut wouldn't be too obvious in terms of procurement, because the Army can still attain some of its requirement while the Navy has a bigger share for its own long-term procurement. So one way is to spread out the distribution over time on the procurement side of things, and focus on projects that allow for plenty of room for domestic defense industrial spin-offs. So with major naval shipbuilding projects, with major naval assets, there is a way to figure out in which you can improve and increase the domestic defense industrial side of things by improving the tier 2, 3, and 4 of the local supply chain beyond the lead integrator, which is often PT PAL anyway. So over time, you can make the argument that investing in the Navy has a bigger spin-off effects to the national economy than just the Army. Because the Army, in terms of scale, will never be as big as a naval shipyard, for example. It's just by size, by size and scale, it's just, that's the way it is. So I think if you spread out the redistribution of the procurement over time, you sign long-term contracts and you boost domestic defense industries, I think you can make the case slowly without necessarily angering the Army too much. Of course, bearing in mind that some of the Army's requirements can also be met domestically, like armored personnel carrier and all that, but that's a separate debate. But I think there is a way to play around with the long-term procurement budget rather than the size of the defense budget per se.
All right, thank you. And I do really concur, because just like any change, I think just flip a switch to immediately have the structural reform, especially with regards to the redistribution. But okay, I guess this would really close it, because this is going to be a long question. We've talked about we just talked about the redistribution of the material resources, but now I want to head into the bureaucracy aspect of it, the hierarchical structures. A lot of your work also relates to the military. I recall that recently you wrote something about the logjams in reform. And how much would you allot Indonesia's, like how much would you assign Indonesia's now lack of a proper structure for the maritime domain policy to such logjams that you call? And should we even, let's say, have a switch that immediately flips the amount of budget redistributed to the Navy, and we have a downsizing of the Navy, of the Army, wouldn't we be faced with a lot of fracturing and stovepiping in both the Navy, who has just been granted an amassing amount of budget, and also the Army? And then how would the culture of this new structure be? Would it still be centralized, or could it be local to the armies of, let's say, provinces? Because this would be, I would try to segue this with a question by Aldi Dio Afrada, who is a history major at Universitas Erlangga, because he asks that the government currently uses a state model policy, which I guess what he means here is that like a central policy. Could that be adjusted to local or traditional policy, as in the Bajau case, for dealing with territorial and border issues, and I guess the maritime issue in general?
Yes, that's definitely long and complicated. Let me try with more straightforward ones. First of all, when it comes to the military, especially whether it's the Navy, Air Force, or the Army, I think it's a matter of principle that we should never, ever allow the local government to be part of it. The military is a national defense endeavor, and the budgeting process, we work extremely hard to make sure that it's centralized and so that the military doesn't have off-budget activities from the local economy. So as a matter of principle, no, we should never allow local governments or local businesses to support the military. I think it opens up the military to local conflicts of interest, not to mention factionalism in case there are crises and all that, and not even discussing issues like corruption and all that. So for me, as a matter of principle, no, it should never be a local endeavor. It has to be a national one. Two, there is a little bit of historical legacy. I mentioned earlier in the talk about the legacies of colonialism and authoritarian rule on the maritime state. One of the manifestations, which I didn't discuss, is its effects on the territorial command structure. So the territorial command structure, we hear it in terms of our history as part of our efforts in the Revolutionary War between 1945 to 1949, right? But the method and the manner in which the Revolutionary War was fought on a territorial command basis had a longer root in the colonial era. So for example, some of the locations of the territorial command units or headquarters were the old headquarters of the colonial units. In the colonial era, military units are located in the middle of the population. So the population forms the circle around the military command. And in some ways, that hasn't changed much for us. So this is why I said there's a mix of colonial legacy and authoritarian rule, because during authoritarian rule, the territorial command was used as a tool of internal monitoring, sometimes repression, intelligence gathering, and all that. And as a consequence of that legacy of territorial command, part of it goes to the Navy as well. So in the Suharto days, for example, after the reform of the territorial command structure, Suharto created a territorial command version for the Navy and for the Air Force, which is why you have a proliferation of smaller naval bases, smaller Air Force bases, and all that, without necessarily the major assets attached to it. So that was abolished over time, but the point is that there is a legacy of the territorialization of the Navy and the Air Force that hasn't fully gone away. Terms like maritime potential, airspace potential is still attached to the same idea as territorial management. How to develop the local potential of your surrounding areas. That's very much a territorial doctrine. So I think that's a part of the legacy that's hopefully we can move from. Now, how do we move forward from that as it relates to the personnel structure and institutions? The problem of logjam is a lot more prevalent, I think, in the Army than the Navy or Air Force. The Army is a few hundred logjams a year. The Navy and the Air Force is about in the dozens. So the scale of logjam is obviously a lot more higher in the Army than the Navy or Air Force. So in that regards, we have less of a problem than the Army in terms of logjams, I mean. And I think the expansion of the military structure in the past few years and in the coming years because of presidential regulation in 2019 will include the Navy as well. So the expansion of the structure isn't just for the Army, but the Navy as well. One way to ensure that we don't have these lingering historical legacies or potential problems with regards to structure and logjam is, one, when we say we want to focus on an integrated joint tri-service doctrine, we should be serious about it. A joint tri-service doctrines means the armed forces as a whole, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, are designed to operate together in a particular way, in a particular scenario. What we have now is the Army has its way of doing things, the Navy has its way of doing things, the Air Force has a way of doing things. Let's combine them together. That's not the same thing as integration. That's just combining things. And we see this manifestation of combination in the way that the procurement budget is set, in the way that the defense planning is set, in the way that the scenarios are set. The Navy has its own way of thinking about sea control and maritime security. The Army has its way of thinking about land combat, and so does the Air Force. So their own respective doctrines require a longer process of integration. I think under SBY, there were discussions for this joint doctrine. It's being drafted, but it's not clear yet on how you have the integration when the scenario planning remains driven by individual service thinking rather than a scenario-based planning that combines all three. So the scenario, without going too detailed into the weeds of defense planning, we have a historical fallacy of relying on what is known as a threat-based planning versus capability-based planning rather than scenario-based planning. And this makes the individual services based on the likely threats the service is likely to encounter and what kind of capabilities the service wants, rather than under what scenarios will the Army be used in a particular way with the Navy and the Air Force. And this is a much longer term project, because without figuring out a way to integrate the doctrine and the tri-service planning, every structure and organization would proceed individually based on the requirements of each of the services. If the Army adds one division, then the Navy adds one division. If that means the Air Force adds one more. So it's more about matching the progress of the institutional development from each service's perspectives rather than figuring out what we want to do with these new services, with these new units and new command that we're thinking. Even the Joint Regional Defense Command, the Kogab Wilhan, was initially designed to be a tri-service combatant command, if you will, that integrates the Army and Air Force and the Navy. But what we have now are skeleton units, pick and choose from the different services, but they haven't been trained, deployed, trained, and potentially employed together. So this is still very much in the developmental stage. So I don't know how far we can go on pretending that in the absence of a joint doctrine and a joint training and education, that we can figure out a better way to structure the institution to avoid promotional logjams. Right now, it's more about figuring out the most efficient organization for each of the individual services.
All right, thank you so much once again. Evan, I would like to just wrap up. Again, these were the challenges and the opportunities, I guess, of Indonesia as a maritime state. It was interesting that you brought up the quote, geography is destiny, because that has been in the heart of geopolitics as an idea ever since Johann Rudolf Schellen first initiated the discipline. So I guess this is to wrap up, and I guess I want to ask a closing statement, but I want to relate this to that idea of geography is destiny. There's also been the eponymous book by John Luke Gallup, Is Geography Destiny? ? That's more of a geoeconomics book, but how much agency do you think we have as policymakers to be in the future for students of SGPP to change this, to control over our geography, over geography controlling us?
Yes, I think geography is destiny, but it's not a final one. As in how fast, how slow, how effective we are at managing our geographic destiny means that it is still incumbent upon the domestic institutions of the countries. In Indonesia's case, that is incumbent on the political institutions and whether or not we can elect the right leadership and whether or not the right leadership can then design the right institutions to manage well, our so-called destiny. So just because geography provides destiny, that doesn't mean all of our options are only set by geography. We set our options, but that depends on what kind of leadership we can elect and what kind of institutions they can design. And this is where I think the ups and downs of states, the rise and fall of governments, and to what extent each of the state can maximize its potential or not hinges. So the geography is necessary. It's a starting point. It's not the final point, and it's certainly not sufficient to achieve state transformation or state development or whatever outcome you want. But the starting point remain, I think, within the realm of geography.
All right. Once again, thank you so much, Evan. I know I've been saying thank you a lot, but this is because I'm very grateful for every utterance that came from you. It's been very insightful. Thank you also to the total. I think there was a total of 71 participants at peak that have attended this webinar. This is just one of the many series of webinars that SGPP is going to host. We will have more in the future. So if you would like to keep on updating with regards to the next webinar, please follow our social media at SGPP Indonesia, mainly on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. Once again, I would like to apologize now to people who have not managed to get their questions answered, but I'm sure you can ask Evan directly. He's available on Twitter. Add to his 11,000 followers and ask him. He's very responsive on Twitter. So thank you once again, everyone, for your time. Good afternoon. Oh, wait, a PSB Corona message service announcement that is obligatory. Don't forget to always wash your hands, wear a mask if you go outside, but try to stay at home if you don't have to. I know we're nearing our end of transitionary period. And don't forget to maintain physical distance with people and avoid crowded spaces. Thank you once again, and goodbye, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.